Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I am Aaron Blumberg, SWFLN's Continuing Education Coordinator, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Accessibility Points. A is for Accessibility. We have a wonderful learning opportunity ready for you this morning with Christine Jewell. Christine Jewell has a PhD in American Studies, a Master's in Comparative Religion, and a Bachelor's in English and Religious Studies. She has spent the majority of her career in higher education, teaching humanities, religion, diversity in the United States, educational philosophy, and writing at a variety of institutions in Michigan and Florida. She also has experience working with nonprofit organizations and federal grant management, working to enhance services and resources for people with disabilities. She is a creativity and accessibility consultant, keynote speaker, and presenter. Please welcome Christine and enjoy her webinar this morning. Christine?
Well, thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate that very kind introduction, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be here today and reflect on, think about, hopefully learn a little bit about accessibility and how it influences your work and your work environment. I appreciate, Aaron, your never-ending patience with my learning curve with setting this all up, and Luli for your ongoing faith in me and that I can bring something of value to these webinars, to Diana, our captioner, for helping make this webinar on accessibility more accessible. So as Aaron briefly mentioned, this is the first webinar in a kind of about accessibility, and I just wanted to give you kind of a heads up about what might be coming up. I'm still very much constructing all of these, but these are the general topics. So, I think today we're gonna lay the foundations, the groundwork, some definitions, a little history, some context about the idea of accessibility, what it means, how it affects us, our patrons, libraries, our attitudes, but this is a really, really complex topic, and there's no way to really do it all in 6 webinars, but this is kind of the first try around that I'm planning on heading. So the upcoming ones are cultures, both culture of compliance and of gentleness, 2 very separate things. C is for courage, E is for empowerment. There's a lot of power issues connected with accessibility and the idea of ableism, which we'll talk about in a little bit. S is for the idea of special needs, and also another S for safety. So there's a lot of angles that we can do, and I'm hoping that we can get to some point where we can start having some conversations about this. So you don't have to write in the chat box for this, but if you want to, please feel free to do. But just put in your notes, just a quick check-in. I think it's important to just at the outset figure out what you want to gain from this webinar, or why are you attending, or is there a particular aspect about accessibility, or as you will soon see, disabilities, because we can't really talk about accessibility without talking about disability. Is there something specific that you want to address or, better understand today? And I also want to say that you are the reason I am here. So you're never interrupting me. We have a lot of slides to cover. I'm starting to have some anxiety about I put way too many slides in here, but we'll see what we can do. But I would like you to see me as a resource. So if there's a question or a topic or something else that you come across in this webinar, just jot a note, and my contact information will be at the end. You can contact me at any time to initiate a conversation, and we can, I'd be happy to talk with you further about this. So please view me as a resource, somebody that you or anybody at your libraries can contact at any time. I am not hard to find. I am very accessible. You have phone, email, whatever. We're always connected, right? And the other thing I wanted to mention with this, as you're kind of thinking about the reasons you attended today, is that you're going to see that I'm going to do a fair amount of reading of some of the slides. And I want to just give a brief caveat for that. In higher education, I used to tell my students, when they're doing presentations in the classroom, don't stand up there and read the slides, right? We can all read, right? You know, that makes for a really boring presentation in the classroom. But I've had to really rethink that, especially with this series of webinars on accessibility. Because while, yes, ultimately this is a PowerPoint, the format is very different, and it's a webinar, and you may be accessing it now. Seems like we have, you know, quite a few people on right now, but SWFLN posts these on their website afterwards. And if somebody struggles with visual impairments, if somebody is deaf, now thank goodness we have Diana here recording that's great, but somebody might be trying to access the information on this webinar without, you know, being present on here, and that makes a big difference if they can't see what the screen is. So my goal is to try to kind of present in such a way that if a person is struggling with visual disabilities, that they could still kind of get a sense of what the webinar is. Now, I am not perfect at this. This is still kind of a very new thing for me, so it's a learning curve. So I just want you to think about that, and you know, as you're going. So my goals for this particular presentation, and I do think it's important to have goals. I just, you know, it's very difficult. I think sometimes there's so much material and so many topics. It's a passion of mine. There has to be a way to focus. So this is the initial try of focusing on accessibility. So first, you know, I want to give you a very brief reminder of what other previous SWFLN resources are connected to accessibility. There's quite a few out there that they have. I want to spend some time defining accessibility and disability, both broadly and specifically, just so you can kind of get an idea of where these conversations are already occurring in your library, or where might be a good place to initiate conversations about them. I would like to give you some historical context on accessibility and disability, mainly via disability rights. And these are based on the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, because I think that's the primary way that, that this topic intersects our libraries and our work. I'm going to give you some wonderful resources, or at least point you in the direction. You might already know about these, but I think it's good to just kind of go back to ALA guidelines in some areas where libraries already have begun, or maybe where you can continue or begin conversations about accessibility at your libraries. And the short version of that one is you do not have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of resources out there already on accessibility, how to make your websites accessible, plain language, first-person language, a lot of the things on policies and procedures that I'm going to try to encourage you that's a really good starting point for these conversations. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I'm just going to try by the end, in the last one, give you some tips on etiquette and point you in the direction of those handouts. And then you really have to decide how to best take this back to your colleagues, back to your libraries, you know, what you're going to do with this information. So, and again, just a note on those handouts, you do not have to print them out. You do not have to have them before this webinar makes sense. They're just pointing you in a direction for resources. So you don't feel free to save a tree. And just kind of in the back of your head, I like to plant seeds in webinars, and hopefully by the end of the 90 minutes that we have, you know, some of these seeds can grow into something. And my ultimate goal is that by the end of the webinar, you have more questions than answers, because answers are, you know, change with time and context and who we are, how our libraries and organizations evolve. The answers are constantly changing because our world is constantly changing. So my goal is that by the end you'll have more questions than answers. And so the seeds that I want to plant is that, you know, that you can, number one, ask the questions. Ask the questions. Number two, initiate the conversations. And three, keep the phrase in your head, nothing about me without me. Okay, nothing about me without me. That is a phrase that I have come across in my work with organizations and trying to make them more accessible and safer for people with disabilities. That your best resources in this crazy process that we're trying to do about making our libraries accessible, your best resources are people with disabilities, are patrons with disabilities, are the organizations that day-to-day deal with disability issues and accessibility issues. So, you know, nothing about me without me means if these people aren't at the table in those conversations, we're missing a big point. So, you know, just kind of think about that. By the end of the webinar, hopefully you'll have some tools and resources to ask the questions, initiate the conversations, and keep in mind nothing about me without me. Okay, so as kind of a brainstorming exercise to start our discussion on accessibility and to illustrate how very small nuances can point to much deeper implications and stereotypes and prejudices in our daily work. And note, these may be intentional or unintentional. Doesn't matter. Just take a look at these 4 signs that I have arranged on this slide. Okay, so I'm going to describe them. All 4 are blue, rectangular, with white lettering. I'm betting that you have seen all 4 of these in some place or another. Likely one of these or one like it are in the parking lots of your library. The first shows a person in a wheelchair, or a symbol that indicates a person in a wheelchair, with the word handicapped above and the word parking below. The second one has that same image of the person in a wheelchair with just simply the word parking below. The third one has the same image, again, that person's in a box, interesting, but then the words disabled parking only. And then the last one has that person again, and then the words accessible parking only on it. So just a couple of questions, and you can feel free to, again, write your responses in the chat box or just reflect on these in your notes. You know, I'd like this to be interactive, but I understand that there's so much material in here that might not really be very possible. But just kind of jot down in your notes or an idea. Do you think that the messages on these 4 signs are the same? Or do you think that there are possibly hidden messages that accompany these signs? I know on one level, these signs serve a similar function to designate parking spaces for people who use wheelchairs. But I have to tell you, when I see the word handicapped, or even the word disabled, I wince a little. These words label and categorize people. I think these words are outdated and actually harmful. Okay? To some words, they contain assumptions. They use words and images to create a separation, to divide space. I mean, literally and figuratively, I think. You know, you're setting aside parking spaces. A space that provides access, but they also imply an either-or situation. Either you are this or you are that. And there's variances in the connotation and the denotation, I think, of these words. Okay? Who is able to do something? Who is not? It goes, you know, the list can go on and on. So much in just a sign, right? Which of these signs, I'm just kind of asking these, again, rhetorical questions, or feel free to answer in the chat box if you want. Which of these signs do you think you would most like to see in your library? You know, or in your library's parking lot? And these are just 4. You know, so just something to kind of think about and brainstorm. The main point of this exercise is that we cannot have a conversation about accessibility without coming up with the biases and the stereotypes that are connected to the idea of disability. The 2 are linked, for better or worse, until we can get to a place as a society where we can recognize and include differences, much more so than we are today. Accessibility and disability are linked. You know, with that, I want to convey that I think that there is hope. Okay, there's a lot of people and organizations working toward making a difference in the way that we work in our libraries, in our society in general, our businesses. And I think that, you know, the way that we serve our patrons, the way that we are constantly striving to improve and learn, we've made progress. Okay, the fact that you are on this webinar today, right here, right now, is indicative of the fact that we are making progress. You care enough about accessibility to attend a webinar, to spend some time listening about it. So the first goal, I had mentioned that I wanted to just briefly let you know there are more webinars than this. They're on SWFLN's website. There's kind of an increasing capacity of topics, but these are some of the ones that I think are most directly connected to what we're doing today. Those are the dates that they originally occurred, but like I said, they're accessible right now. Dealing effectively with difficult patrons and students. There's a fair amount of stuff in there about ways that we can help better serve people who have disabilities, or providing and understanding resources with patrons with disabilities. Two-part one there, full of resources. And again, how to assist patrons with disabilities most effectively. Everything from apps to electronic resources, you know, what have you. It's all there and in there. The other thing is the Diversity Discovery Institute webinars, and I know that that a lot of you attendees may have attended those as well, but there's a lot of overlap with what we're talking about here, because a lot of the diversity webinars are talking about racism or sexism or homophobism or being inclusive. Ableism is discrimination against people with disabilities. So a lot of, brief version, I'm going to give you a better definition in a little bit, but a lot of the Diversity Discovery Institute webinars will definitely overlap with this. And even if you have attended these, I guarantee if you go back and review those with the tools and the lens that you get today thinking about accessibility, you're going to see those webinars in a whole nother light. So I really think that that's important, and those are ongoing as well. Both year 1 and 2 are on the website already. We're well into year 3, the ABCs, and we're continuing to go with those. But there is a lot of overlap with these. So I think it's important that, you know, to recognize that you are already a part of SWFLN, and that, you know, your explorations in coming to the webinar today is a step in the right direction. And the short version of all of that is it's complicated. Okay. It's connected. It's something that we, you know, we're ongoing. If you look at these, I love these word collages. If you look at some of the words that are in here with accessibility, you know, you see disability, you see internet, you see organization, transcripts, you know, helpful. All of these things, you know, are connected to the idea of accessibility, and I think that it's important to realize that it's an ongoing and complicated learning process. And I just, again, wanted to thank you for being here again. It matters. It matters that you're trying to learn, that you're trying to find ways to, you know, improve your skills, improve your knowledge, improve your awareness of these issues. And I'm just really very grateful for you. I'm seeing some of the echoes of the comments on the signs. So it looks like most people were looking at number 4 of those signs and thinking that, you know, that might have a different feel to it. Maybe just one more seed. Okay, I lied. I'm changing strides. And I'm going to give you one more seed. There is an external component to disability, and to accessibility, and there's an internal component. Okay, so the sign is an external component, but some of the comments there was it feels different. There's an internal response to accessibility, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because it's very true. It's a complicated process, but there's parts of it that we internalize, and we have to focus on that. Sometimes the way that it makes us feel is and being aware of that is the best place to start. It's the best place to start. So thank you for, you know, your feedback on the signs, and we're gonna get kind of into the first part of our webinar and the second goal, defining accessibility and disability. So broadly, I view, and this is just kind of my own definition or my own way of framing the definitions more specifically that I'll give you in a few minutes. I like diagrams and equations and things that try to simplify complex processes in a kind of a quick and easy way. And this is a quick and easy equation that you can look at. So we have the person or the patron served. You add in the disability, and note that that can be visible or it can be hidden. We can't always see a disability. You add in the library's response, or word that we'll talk about a little bit later, the accommodation, and all those three things together equal accessibility. So I think that in a broad sense, it's defining accessibility, we tend to be focused on, or at least mainly focused on, how our patrons physically view and access our libraries. So that internal component is important too, though. A quick note, I noticed on the ALA website, they have recognized that most libraries are way behind on where they would like to be in terms of employing people with disabilities too. And it's not just libraries. I'm not trying to single out libraries. Obviously, I know my audience, but it's everyone. Society as a whole has a hard time employing people with disabilities. I want to give you just one example of that. I have a former student. His name is John. I spent a fair amount of my career in higher education, so this was in university back in Michigan. He double majored in psychology and nonprofit administration, dual major. Graduated with honors. He's an absolute whiz at computers. He's an excellent public speaker. He runs his own nonprofit business and website. He's got an amazing sense of humor. He also happens to have cerebral palsy and use a wheelchair. So I was talking with him, and he spent almost 8 years since graduating with honors and finding a job. My heart just breaks. He was telling me that on paper he looks fantastic. When he makes it to the interview, bam, he can tell in about 5 minutes if it's a good fit or not. And mostly, obviously, since he's been struggling, it's not. He does have a full-time job currently, but he is providing technological assistance for a company online. He wants to have that face-to-face interaction with people. He wants to have that job where he can, connect with people and be with, an organization. But he has come up with so many barriers in employment and companies unwilling to make accommodations that just simply prohibit certain positions to him. I didn't have the thought until just this very moment. I need to suggest that he look at libraries. I honestly hadn't thought about that before. He would be such a great resource in libraries. Okay, so just keep in mind that the accessibility can function in multiple levels, in multiple areas. So keep this in mind, not only to better serve your patrons, but also to examine your internal components of libraries and your employment practices, your handbooks, that sort of thing. All right, so we got some other definitions here on accessibility. Easily approached or entered. For example, the stadium is accessible via public transportation. Number 2, easily obtained, accessible money, accessing banks. Easy to talk to or get along with, an accessible manager. This is another good one. Again, kind of indicating that internal component, like how accessible is that person? How accessible is your library to a person walking in the door? Are people stressed out, frowning, running around, or does somebody take the time to smile and greet with you, or greet you and have a conversation with you right away? I understand, we've got always our multitasking and have multiple things that we're doing at any given point, and we all have good days and we have bad days. But, this is, again, just another aspect to think about accessibility. Easy to understand or appreciate. We're going to talk at the end a little bit about the idea of person-first language and a little bit about plain language. What is it, if someone has a developmental or intellectual disability or has cognitive disabilities, excuse me, what does that mean when you're using big fancy words and they don't understand? Is our language accessible? Number 5, define or designed for use by anyone regardless of physical ability. And I think this is, the level that most folks think about accessibility. Easily swayed or influenced, accessible to flattery. Maybe not so much, but my favorite one is this last one here. And I like all of these because they have the idea of easy, and that's really what it is. The ease, or how easily can someone access our programs, our libraries. So this one, the degree to which someone can use something in his or her environment or society has a common application in regards to people with disabilities and access to a service or physical space. Okay? So I want you to think about this in terms of your physical space. I'm betting most of you are pretty up to code with that. But to services, but also maybe to things you might not necessarily think about. Flyers, websites, language, and the kind of the environmental attitude that you might have going on with that. And I think that, we have the succinctness. I apologize. I'm battling chronic bronchitis, so my throat is raspy, and I'm trying not to cough into the microphone. I know you can't get it, but I've been kind of struggling with this. So the ease of which somebody can access your library or the programs, that is at the heart of accessibility. All right, so really what this is thinking about your libraries from a different perspective, thinking about your libraries from the lens of a disability. It doesn't matter which one. Any disability you can think of, you can look at your materials, your programs, your resources, and it's going to look a little bit differently. So let's just, some sample questions to think about here. How easy is it to enter your library if you're in a wheelchair? Okay. What about using your bathrooms? The front desk? What about computers? Are there different levels of computers for people in a wheelchair to come, access those? What about, turning around in the aisles? Okay, that's just one thing, a wheelchair. Now, what if you're blind? You have visual impairments. Is your website easy to use? Can you adjust the color or the font size? Another one, does anyone at your library know sign language? Do you know the interpreters in your community? Okay, I think that, there's a practical component here. And this gets back to kind of asking the questions. What questions does your library need to ask to make your spaces, your services, and your programs more accessible? So really, I just want to repeat that again. What questions does your library need to ask? I know on certain levels your libraries are fine and they're accessible and they're wonderful, but it's the hidden areas that we want to get at to make the accessibility all inclusive. Okay, so if you want to think about it, or write in your notes or in the chat box, if you can come up with any of the questions, that would be awesome to share. But really, it's a simple one. How accessible is this blank? Okay, how accessible is this? Whatever it is. Let's just do an example here. A flyer. Okay, you might have to create a flyer to give an announcement for an upcoming program. Okay, so you've just created a flyer to promote a program or workshop. Think about it. Okay, it's a piece of paper, probably 8.5 by 11. Could be hung on a bulletin board, maybe near the entrance to your library or near the bathrooms, some sort of high traffic area. Okay, how accessible, I know this is going to sound strange, but how accessible is that flyer to someone who can't read? How accessible is that flyer to someone who is blind? What about, and think about this, a veteran? Have you looked at this flyer from the perspective of a veteran or from someone who has experienced trauma? You might think, well, why would I need to do that? Veterans and people who have experienced trauma definitely fall under the ADA definition of disability that we're going to get to. What about this flyer? Is the information that's on this flyer also on your website? Because people are accessing your libraries or may want to access your library and its programs, but they can't physically come into the door or have limited capacity. Only, maybe they only have the ability to go out once or twice a month. If the information that's on that flyer is not also on your website, then you're gonna be missing some potential participants. Is the flyer readable? Think about the level that you actually posted it. If you are sitting in a wheelchair, is it readable? Think about how the light angle hits that flyer. Think about the colors that are used. Think about the contrast. Think about, does it use very plain language? You might need to have 2 flyers or 3 flyers to be able to convey and be accessible to people who have disabilities who might not be able to understand a flyer. Excuse me. I have to give you an example. Okay, my stepson Talon has a disability. It is called Fragile X syndrome. And physically, to look at him, you cannot see this disability. Okay, he's 6'3", he's 220-some pounds, he plays Special Olympics, he's very strong. His is a cognitive disability, and he basically can't read the way we do. He can recognize certain words, but he'll to be able to pick up a book or a flyer, he's just never going to be able to do that. Although there are some apps, we've been doing some apps on his phones, some text-to-speech apps that have been very successful with him. Now he can get some text messages, copy it to his text-to-speech app, and he can, read what people are texting him. And he's having such a grand time with this. It's fantastic. But the reason I bring him up is because one of his favorite places in the world to go is the library. And I've talked to him about it before, and I say, Talon, why do you like to go to the library? My perception of the library is, words and, books and that sort of thing. And he just kind of looked at me like I was crazy. And he's like, well, I like to go to the library because they're nice to me there. And my heart just kind of broke at that point where I'm thinking, it's so simple. We get stuck in these labels and categories, and I was viewing him solely through his disability. And don't get me wrong here. I love him tremendously. He is my son. He's been my son for, 25 years via marriage. But I had gotten caught into just viewing him only through his disability. I thought, he can't read. Why would he want to go to the library? And it had nothing to do with the fact that, I knew he could get audiobooks, but he doesn't like audiobooks. It was kind of just a mystery. And it was just so simple. It was that emotional accessibility that he liked for the library. So I think it's important to understand how those underlying contexts for accessibility and disability is used and who's actually doing the defining. And so I think that, again, as I mentioned, accessibility and disability are linked. We have to jump to disability. Okay, so it's defined in a variety of ways. Some of those definitions are developed by professional organizations. Some are used by disability groups, individuals with disabilities. Some are used by government organizations and projects. I think that it's important to, have a definition or be aware of a definition of disability, or at least a working definition. How would or how does your library define disability? What definitions are you using, and what sort of baggage, for lack of a better word, comes with those definitions? In general, I try to, if I can, avoid the word disability. I think it's charged with negative connotations. I came across a phrase a couple of weeks ago and doing my research for this one, developmental, not disabilities, but developmental differences. I so like that so much better. Just because there's so many negative things coming with the idea of disability. And I think that, I think you have to take a close look at your handbooks, your policies, your procedures, the way things are written to be able to understand this, this word and call it into question. If you can see how or if it is limiting accessibility in any way. Always having that lens, you know, is this accessible? You know, what is this wording saying? You know, and I think even if it doesn't, no patrons ever see your employee handbook or your policies or your procedures, you know, that doesn't, you know, that's great. Maybe that's a great thing if they're very poorly written, but it impacts you. It impacts your employees. It impacts your new hires. It impacts a person with disabilities who might be seeking employment. You know, are your employee handbooks and policies and procedures accessible on the website? Should they be? You know, there's some difficult questions here. And just kind of a side note, I think it's really important, too, that you can learn a lot by examining the language that is used or is absent, by examining carefully your written policies and procedures. I know it's not the most exciting read, but I learned in my years of working on government grants designed to improve safety and access for people with disabilities, one of the fastest and most efficient ways to begin organizational transformation is in policies and procedures. If it's in there, it can provide the support and the structure for adjusting the daily practices and tasks. And I know it's not always, you know, just because you have a policy and procedure written down doesn't mean that the practice takes place. There's often a disconnect. But that's also a place for that second seed, initiating the conversations. If there is a disconnect between your policies, procedures, and practices, then, you know, maybe that's a really good place to start thinking about deeper levels of accessibility in your libraries. Just a thought. Okay? So in defining disability, I think there's kind of two main competing models. Okay? And a spoiler alert, neither of them work for me. We're getting there. But there's two of them. The first is a medical model. And this really views disability as a problem, okay? Disability is caused by disease, by trauma, or other health, translate physical, conditions, okay? It says that disability is within the person, and managing or curing the disability is the goal, okay? So I think that there are some good things to this model. Some disabilities are caused by disease or trauma, but some are not. Okay? Some questions really arise for me immediately within this medical model, and you can find convincing arguments within the healthcare system to really philosophy departments, really. What is a person? Is a person just physical or biological? And can or should we even try to cure a disability? Okay? I have to, you know, going back to Talon, in this medical model, when he was first diagnosed, he was 6. He's 32 now. When he was diagnosed with Fragile X at 6, the doctors told us, okay, this is what's going to happen. We know males with Fragile X, by the time he gets to be about 20, 22, he's going to peak. He's going to peak out intellectually. He's going to peak out, and he'll probably start kind of regressing. But you can be assured, by the time, you know, he reaches 22 or 23, he's, you know, that's about the best you're going to see from him. You know, and at the time we're like, well, I guess we'll see. You know, we're listening to doctors, you know, who are the specialists in the country saying this. Well, I can tell you, 100% wrong. Totally off base. Talon is 32. He is growing in ways socially, developmentally, sense of humor, intellectually, using language. He's off the charts. And while part of me, you know, the academic in me kind of wants to take him back to those doctors and those experts and say, ha, look, you were wrong. There's also part of me that kind of says, what's the point? You know, he is who he is. Let's just make his life as pleasant as possible. And, you know, obviously his disability is not a problem. But, you know, this medical model of disability, as this next slide shows you that, you know, putting the disability at the center and calling it a problem gives rise to all these other little bubble areas, you know, doctors, surgeons, specialists, you know, special education, schools and psychologists, social workers, training centers, sheltered workshops, you know, special transportation, speech and occupational therapy, all these systems. And I'm not saying that those are bad systems by any stretch. I'm just saying that all of those have been kind of designed with this core of a belief that disability is a problem. And there are wonderful people working in these organizations. You know, in all my years, I honestly never met an organization. I never met, you know, an institution. I've only met people. And there are wonderful people in these organizations and institutions making a difference every day to increase accessibility for people who have been labeled with disabilities. What I'm trying to do here is just kind of raise awareness at the heart of some of the problems that we struggle with accessibility, because how we view disability is integral to that. Okay, so just something to think about with that. And I do love diagrams. If you've been on any other webinars or, you know, any speeches, I always try to include a diagram or two. But it's really designed to fix or help people with disabilities, and that is a good thing. But it also creates kind of a dichotomy. It's putting a person with a disability as less than or abnormal, or, you know, with certain abilities are, you know, having certain abilities is better than not having certain abilities. I think it ultimately marginalizes a lot of people, and it forces us to create a lot of complicated categories and labels, and again contributes to the culture of ableism, which we're going to talk about in just a bit. Okay, so I think that excuse me, you know, with that medical model, or even with this next one that we're going to talk about, the social model, examine, you know, your particular policies, procedures, overall culture, training, information, and I think that you can see pretty quickly, you know, you can see if that, you know, medical model or this social model is at the heart of them. Okay, so the social model, I think that it has some very good points, but it is also very limiting. Okay, so it forces people and organizations to marginalize and separate people. The social model focuses on barriers, prejudice, exclusion, and defining kind of who is and who is not disabled. There are physical, intellectual, or psychological differences, and these do not have to lead to, you know, labeling as a disability unless society fails to accommodate and include them. Okay, so there's, you know, I think you can see between these already. There's some nuances, and there's some good things with that, but it's still got something missing. Okay, excuse me. Okay, so I think the main strength of the social model is that it brings in the idea of accommodation. Okay, so if you look at this, it acknowledges that the structures in society are the problem, not the disability. Okay, so then it kind of starts talking about, you know, segregated services, or that we have prejudice, or we have poverty, or we devalue people with disabilities. Note that the medical model is in there as kind of a part of this, which I think is a little bit problematic, because as we saw, that's not really a perfect model. It's just another layer. You know, if we have inaccessible environments or transportation, all of those structures, you know, the medical system has some serious growth to do to better accommodate and serve people with disabilities. You'd think it'd be the other way around, but it's really not. I think it's you know, one last idea that I want you to think about is that it's underlying both of these models of disability is this pervasive idea of ableism. Okay, there's still an underlying flaw And, an ism, as you can think of, other isms, racism or sexism, it's a discrimination against a group of people. Okay, and in this case, people with disabilities. So I want to make sure that you have a good working definition of ableism, and this isn't all inclusive, but it's a pretty good one. I've seen a lot of definitions. So I just want to read it to make sure that you understand that this is really the heart of the matter here, of what we're doing. Ableism is a pervasive system of discrimination and exclusion that oppresses people with disabilities. It's a system in which people without disabilities maintain supremacy over people with disabilities through a set of attitudes, behaviors, social structures, rewards, and privileges and benefits of the society that are available to individuals according to their presumed, this is an important word, presumed level of ability. Ableism operates on an individual, an organizational, an institutional, a cultural, and societal level. If I'm making kind of the assumption that you have heard of this word before, but if you have not, I highly recommend you start digging into this, because this is a huge, huge component of making our services and programs in libraries better or more accessible by fighting this. I think that it's really this is the heart of why I'm doing this. I think you can see that ableism operates very well in both the medical model of disability and the social model. The key to figuring out is how to make your library's programs and processes more accessible is to find out where ableism has taken root. Okay, the last line, I think, is the most profound for the scope of this webinar, so I'm going to repeat it again. Ableism operates on an individual, an organizational, an institutional, a cultural, and societal level. There are many, many ways that we can find out where ableism is operating, and if we can name it, if we can claim it, we can make it more accessible. Because it's an ongoing process. And this is really my small contribution, I think, in fighting and raising awareness and education on any level or arena in any way. Ableism, these pervasive attitudes, and the harm that comes from the discrimination against people with disabilities. I believe accessibility is a right, a basic human right. And it has taken our society a long time to get to this point, to create the language and the laws and that acknowledge and support this right. Okay, we have a long way to go. We're getting there, but I really think that accessibility is a basic human right. And when you think about it that way, it just kind of reframes some of the other issues or barriers or maybe obstacles that people might say, well, we can't do it that way. We've always done it this way, and why should we accommodate, make this big change because we only have 2 people in wheelchairs who use this library? There could be all kinds of excuses, okay? But when you recognize, like, hey, that's ableism, you're discriminating against somebody's basic human right to have accessible information resources. And libraries are just at the forefront of that, I think more so because you're serving the public, you're dealing with resources and information. You are the beacons, the guideposts, the lighting way of, where do you go to get information. That's the primary goal. So again, just some definitions to kind of start, and we're going to go very briefly through some of these other areas. I'm moving into my third goal here, historical context of accessibility and disability rights. And, I have to mention that, I put this diagram right in the center, right at first, because I do think that it connects all these areas. It connects the social model of disability, it connects the medical model, it also brings in what we talked to about, employing people with disabilities. It's going to talk about education a little bit, transportation. It just gives you a lot of different areas where this right impacts and connects to society and basic services and resources that we offer. I think that you'll see this diagram too. It's kind of been at the heart and underlying support of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is in 1990, but I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with it, but I'm going to give you kind of a broad overview leading up to that. Now I have to first tell you, I'm an interdisciplinarian by educational background. I am not a historian. So my goal is not really to give you a comprehensive history. It's to give you, and you'll have access to this PowerPoint for those of you who want to learn more or put more resources in the hands of your libraries. It's just to give you a brief history of disability rights and just kind of frame the ADA, because a lot of times people say, well, ADA, 1990, and you realize, it didn't just spring up out of nowhere. But I want to give you some key turning points, some names, some movements, this is loosely grouped by decade, so you can kind of, if you've got a particular decade you like, but we're going to whiz through this, okay, just so you know. All right, so 1960s, we got President Kennedy, 1963, calling for a reduction in the number of persons confined to residential institutions. 1964, Civil Rights Act, fantastic publication, Christmas in Purgatory, just heart-wrenching, appalling conditions at state institutions for people with developmental disabilities. And we have the Architectural Barriers Act passed. Okay, all things leading up. 70s, we've got the Fair Labor Standard Act. It's kind of amended to bring people with disabilities other than blindness to the sheltered workshop system. There's really kind of different tracks through this disability rights movement, and again, people have labeled and categorized. So sometimes, if you look into deaf culture and history of, deaf culture and people in this country, you're going to see something completely different than you're going to see if you have blind culture. Of course, you have somebody like Helen Keller who had both, and you get this. She was also a very political figure and an activist. And politics is connected to it. The laws are connected to it. So I just think that, it's good to get a broader view of it. And by 72, you get the SSI, Supplemental Security Income Program fine. You get centers for independent living starting to be created all over. A lot of movements there. You've got the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and that's kind of an important one, too. That one was requiring access to programs and activities that are funded by federal agencies and for federal employment. It also established the Access Board, and, it's really trying to get, at the governmental level, people with disabilities involved. Education for all handicapped, there's that word again. Did you wince? I did. Education for All Handicapped Children Act is passed. And I think in my cut and paste I got too rigorous here because I knew that this was just too much history to give you. But I also, in 1975, the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that has been so much in the news lately, was formed in this time period. Ensuring that children with disabilities get a free and appropriate education. Many revisions over the years. 1978, you've got the Title VII of the Rehabilitation Act. That's giving federal funding for centers and independent living. This idea, the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, has been revised many times over the years, and so I think that there's a lot of fear out there right now that a lot of this history, a lot of this hard-fought legislation is in danger. But again, we're going to just keep going here. We've got 80s. We've got Civil Rights Institutionalized Persons Act. Reagan administration did lots of chops and cut benefits. We got, lots of more things hitting the media and the news. Air Carrier Act is formed. Employment Opportunities for Disabled Americans Act. Again, we've got protection and advocacy groups coming up in here. There's a lot of folks starting to rise up and demand rights. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. 1988, we have students at Gallaudet University shut down and occupy their campus, demanding a selection of a deaf president. It's a deaf institution, so it's Fair Housing Act and amendments are adding people with disabilities as a protected group. I think it's really important too to I want to make a caveat here about deaf culture, just very briefly. Many people in the deaf community do not view deafness as a disability, and they are absolutely advocating, that it's not a disability. It's a subculture. It's got a complete own language. Again, I think this points back to the idea of ableism and labeling people who are different. And that deaf people would be so much better off if we could just cure them of their deafness. I think that, it's complicated. I want to give you two examples. and one is, comes from my years of coaching Special Olympics. We had two deaf athletes, and they both, were about the same age. I think that they were both, about from the same socioeconomic status, both African American, near and dear to my hearts. They both got cochlear implants at about the same time in their educational process. Okay, the first one, for lack of a better word, took. Okay, it took. Andre the athlete was able to hear way better than he had before. In fact, I'll never forget the fact that, the time he called me up on the phone. First of all, I couldn't believe he was actually using the phone. He had never done that before. Called me up and he said, Coach, I can hear birds. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that's so wonderful. The second cochlear implant on Willie absolutely did not take. And he continued to really not be able to hear. That's okay. In Special Olympics, we learned how to sign. He was primarily a basketball player. We learned how to sign, pass, and rebound, and run, and all that kind of thing. But Andre helped him, through a lot of things. But it was heart-wrenching in that respect because, Andre, I could see ways that his life just blossomed, and Willie, in some extents, didn't. And, he was still struggling with that. The second example I want to get is that it's so quick and easy to label and categorize. In my federal work, I had the opportunity to attend a conference on deaf culture and violence, because the program I was working on was at the intersection of disability and violence, and a whole other webinar topic. But I was at that conference one of two people, the person who was attending with me, one of two people who was hearing and could not sign. So I was immersed in deaf culture of people having conversations around me that I could not participate in. And let me tell you, that was one of the that was probably the most eye-opening day I have ever had doing this work. I have never felt so out of the loop, so excluded, and not because they were trying to. I did not know the language. I did not know the culture. I did not know the rules. I constantly felt like I was bumbling up against somebody, and they were so kind and so gracious when there was part of me in there that I thought, I have been blind, not to, add that on, but I've been blind to disabilities. I've been blind to my own biases. And I've been working in this for a long time. I've been raising a son. I've been coaching. But how could, it was really humbling in that, you think that you have this understanding and then you suddenly realize you don't even have a clue. But, I think that those two experiences, you really get to the heart of the matter, that you have to learn to be able to really empathize and put yourself in another person's abilities or disabilities, however you want to frame it, before you can even really get to the point where you can ask questions. So I think, in going through this history, my sense is that just to try to give you some of this stuff so that like, there's a huge long history of resources and places that you can go. Okay, the big one here is that, we're getting into the 90s here. 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, is signed. We get some organizations formed here, not dead yet. That's connected with euthanasia. There are still practices of their, around saying, it's better off if that person has a disability and they're on life support. We need to terminate life. There's all kinds of stuff. We got Robert Dole had a, visible disability that, that was, kind of a battle cry for a lot of organizations. Let's get to the heart of the matter. And I want to just kind of give you a brief frame for this, okay? So in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was formed. In terms of how that impacts us, right now it's still impacting us, but when this was formed, 1990, and I don't know the ages of all the folks on here, but this is basically pre-internet, pre-technology that we use every single day. So there's been a lot of room for revisions on here, and it was a wonderful leap forward. Okay, it ensures equal opportunity for people with disabilities in employment, state and local government services, public accommodations, commercial facilities, and transportation. Okay, it was also mandating, establishments of certain technologies, TDD and telephone relay services. It was revised fairly substantially in 2008, again, primarily to get that technological component in there. I think that it's, important to understand, if you want to go back and obviously read this law, you can get a ton of information. I've tried to kind of succinctly pull out the key points in terms of accessibility and disability for this. So it's basically covering people in three categories. If you currently have a disability, you've had a history of a disability, or if you are perceived as disabled by others, whether or not they actually have a disability. Okay, this is pretty broad, okay? This is all-encompassing, pretty broad, okay? It's talking about how the determination of whether an impairment substantially limits a major life activity has to be made without regard, okay, without regard to the effects of medication, medical supplies, equipment, prosthetics, hearing aids or cochlear implants, mobility devices, assistive technology, reasonable accommodations, or auxiliary aids or services. So it's really a broad definition of, what constitutes a disability, and really how do you have to provide for accessibility. Okay, and just a little bit further nuances. Major life activities include the ability to care for yourself, learn, work, walk, see, hear, speak, breathe. That's a highly underrated one, right? Maintain social relationships among others. Okay, so I mean, as you can see, like, what doesn't this include, right? And I think it really frames this, and you're going to see a definition in a second here, the World Health Organization, which is probably my favorite definition of these, how this really impacts and how we frame the idea of disability. Okay, it was later, and after the amendment in 2008, excuse me, it was expanded to include the definition of a major life activity to immune systems, normal cell growth, neurological and brain, digestive, bowel and bladder, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. I mean, we're again going internal and external, that hidden and not, that visible and invisible component to disabilities. You just don't know what a person is struggling with, what sort of disability. And you could make a fairly good argument we are all struggling with some sort of disability, some sort of baggage, whether there's a name or a label to it, it is beside the point. It's covered under the ADA. Okay, so again, just a little bit nuances here. Perceived as disabled. Okay, so if an individual meets the requirements of being covered by this law, if they are being regarded as having such an impairment. So if we have those prejudices or stereotypes, that's gonna contribute to that. If the individual establishes that he or she has been subjected to an action prohibited under this act because of an actual or perceived physical or mental impairment, whether or not the impairment limits or is perceived to limit a major life activity. Okay? And then they do have kind of a time frame on this one too. It's not regarded as having a disability if the impairment is transitory, or kind of expected to last for 6 months or less, and minor. So I mean, there's some fair wiggle room, but let me tell you, there's a lot of lawsuits out there for people who have said I am being discriminated against this law, and some of those are actually we don't have time to get into it today, but I found library lawsuits. These e-books and these nooks and these things that you have for, to help your patrons are not accessible to people who are blind. Wow. Okay. So what do you do with that? And, really the ADA, I think, and the government, and if these go to, court, it's pretty flexible, and it's a very slow evolving system that, it's not, I don't think it's anything to necessarily worry about, but just know that, this is not to be taken lightly, okay? And again, that last seed, nothing about me without me. The best thing you can do is get people with disabilities using your libraries and ask them, what can we do better? How do you perceive this experience? Could you sit on this, program board? Could you be a part of this? Would you like to volunteer at our libraries? I guarantee the more we include and get people involved, the better. Okay, so we have just going to keep going so we can get through the remainder of this and get you some practical resources and some maybe etiquette that could help you better serve patrons and think about this in more inclusive ways. The World Health Organization defines disability as not something that a person has, but something that occurs outside the person. It's a functional limitation. So disability occurs in the interaction between the person, his or her functional ability, and the environment, including physical, communication, information, and the social policy environments. Again, getting back to those policy and procedures, you can get at the heart of this matter and find out how does this policy interact with people with disabilities? What does this really say? Okay, so I like this really because it emphasizes the function over the diagnosis. If everybody is kind of working with some sort of disabilities, or however you want to put it, that's why I like that. Developmental differences. We all have differences, okay? And it also, this definition equalizes physical and mental functional limitations. It doesn't matter what the disability is. It still has to be accessible. It frames disability as an ordinary part of experience for all people. Excuse me. And the experience of disability can be minimized by environments designed to accommodate, again that word, accommodate varying functional abilities. So really what that gets down to is folks just looking at their programs, their services, their spaces, their attitudes with different lenses on, with absolutely different lenses on. And it takes practice. Just a little bit more on the functional limitations and what some of those are. It could be struggling with balance. They could be cognitive. Could be, depth perception or dimensional extremes. Mental health. SWFLN had a lot of webinars up there on mental health and, treating the homeless that also have a lot of overlaps here that I think that you could apply. Movement and mobility. Respiratory functions. Sensory. Again, sensory, that's a whole other ballgame too. The lighting in your libraries, even sometimes the the olfactory, if chemicals in the air or certain perfumes could be triggering for people with disabilities. There's all kinds of ways that you can go. Voice, speech, and language, stamina, and fatigue. That slide looks funny to me, but so basically some of the reasonable accommodations that can be done are braille, large print, captioning, audio tape, computer access. I apologize if this slide looks funny to you like it does to me. Hopefully, when you download the PowerPoint, it will look a little bit different. But basically, it's just saying that you have to consider some of those accommodations while you're designing your library services. Again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, ALA has recognized that the people with disabilities are a large and neglected minority in the community and are severely underrepresented in the library profession. Sure, that's not telling you something you already don't know. Okay, disabilities cause many personal challenges. In addition, many people with disabilities face economic inequity, illiteracy, cultural isolation, discrimination in education, employment, and the broad range of societal activities. And I'm really hoping that a lot of the upcoming webinars on accessibility points will get at some of these and try to give you some frames to help combat the ableism that is really at the heart of all of these problems. But there's a lot of positive statements too. There's a lot of resources, and I'm going to show you in a sec that the ALA has really got some good resources for you, and you may, although I'm sure you're familiar with the site, it's worth a revisit. You play a catalytic role in the lives of people with disabilities by facilitating their full participation in society. You should be using strategies based on the principles of universal design. Again, that's primarily physical, but also attitudinal. Ensure that your policies, your resources, and services meet the needs of all people. They've got the Office for Literary and Outreach Services, and it gives you assistance and tools to provide the highest level of service to, again, disabled patrons. There it is. That's a phrase I want to call your attention to. They need to edit that. Person first language, patrons with disabilities, not their disabled patrons. Do you see the nuance? And in a second you'll see that again a little bit more. Their website has resources and tools facilitating library outreach, again, collections and recommended sites. There's a lot of different things. Short version, think accessibility, think computer accessibility and guidelines, think internet accessibility, think software accessibility. You might have to increase, different kinds of programs, excuse me, that you have. Understanding the language. Again, here's some tip sheets that are on there that you can get just with assistive technology, learning disabilities, or I love it, learning differences. You can see the language. You can almost see by looking at this how the language itself is changing. Okay, so, and again, they have this toolkit series, 15, tip sheets to help librarians in all kinds of libraries understand and manage access issues. Again, it's a wide range, but it's something I think that it's worth looking for. Service animals too. That's a whole nother area that again we can't get into a lot of details, but there's all kinds of legislation on that. Or service animals and or emotional trauma-based animals that comfort animals. It's amazing. There's all kinds of things to go. In all honesty, these could use some updates. So maybe that's a point to be able to have a conversation in your library and figure out, where could we go. Very specifically too, and I want to give a nod to the handouts at this point too. This Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. This is really this is guidelines connected to the website and the technology that I think that you really have to examine about the accessibility. And there's very specific guidelines now. I know that I'm sure that your websites are created and designed and maintained by a variety of people, but this will just be a starting point. Hey, does our website do this? Do we provide text alternatives for any non-text content so it can be changed into other forms that people need? such as large print, braille, speech, symbols, or simpler language. That last one, the simpler language, plain language, that to me is huge. But again, kind of thinking about this in terms of, alternatives for time-based media, content that can be presented in different ways, simpler layout without losing the information or structure, just to provide, alternatives, really. Can you make it easier for users to see and hear content by separating the foreground and the background? Can you, for example, I kind of toyed with playing how complex could I get with this? Should I make a black slide with white print just to show you the difference in how it focuses and what that might mean, or what happens if you have this beautiful mauve color that everybody loves, but in all honesty, it's not a very good color to put on your presentations. There's tons of nuances, but there's guidelines. You don't have to figure out what you have to do. It's all laid out for what you have to do. The key, I think, for most of us is how do we do it. Functionality, is that available from a keyboard, providing users with sufficient time to read and use content, or are things scrolling by and zipping by very quickly? That would not be good. Not to design content in a way that is known to cause seizures. I never even thought about that. The way the light is there a way that you can provide to help users navigate, to find content? Is there something up there that says, can you call or chat with somebody if you're having trouble with this? How accessible is it? Maybe they can't visually see it, but if they called and talked to somebody, they could, walk through it if they said, if they had that availability, similar to the, like digital reference, but, just something to think about. Is the text content readable and understandable? Do web pages appear and operate in predictable ways, or, was somebody somewhere along the line trying to be creative and, make things, shift and move, and that might be a deterrent to somebody who has a disability. Maximize compatibility with assistive technologies on user computers and devices. Again, I think that's where that Nook legislation came through. Again, this is in the resource guide, but when you go to those web content accessibility guidelines, you get these really detailed screens about how exactly to design this. So this might be the type of resource you put in play of your IT person or who's ever constructing your sites. Okay, so some practical things as we kind of end. So hopefully I'll give you some resources and some practical places where you can go and things to think about when you're interacting with your patrons with disabilities and employees. So first of all, some assumptions. Okay, these are really important to think about. Am I doing this? Do not assume that a person with a disability either wants or requires your assistance. Okay, that could be connected to ableism and your perceptions of, oh wow, that person's in a wheelchair, they need help, or that person, looks like they, have a disability, so I'm going to try to help them. Don't assume it. Don't assume that the rejection of your aid is a personal insult or disrespect. Okay, there's a wide variety of disabilities, and people's responses to their own disabilities and abilities varies. The student that I mentioned to you, John, who has cerebral palsy in a wheelchair, he frames all of his presentations with the fact that do not base your assumptions on cerebral palsy by me, because he's got an incredible sense of humor and he makes fun of himself and his disability. He goes, not all people can do that. And if you make it assume, oh, I met one person with cerebral palsy, so they must all be that. No, that's stereotyping again. So he has a great sense of humor and actually likes to mess with people without disabilities. But that's just him, so it's very different. Everyone is an individual. Everyone's response to their abilities and disabilities is an individual. Don't assume that you know without being told what aid to give. You can always just ask, can I help you with something? It's that simple. Do not assume that a person with one kind of disability has other disabilities. Getting back to John, again, he had cerebral palsy, he's in a wheelchair, severe physical limitations, cognitively smarter than, anyone I know. He's just amazing. So he liked to mess with people because of that, you know. Just think about it. Do not assume a person with a disability is dissatisfied with his or her quality of life and is seeking pity. Again, where does the pendulum swing on your response to a person with a disability? If it swings too far, you're not being accessible. Okay? Do not assume because the person has a disability, he or she is easily offended. Okay? You're going to know just like you would know with anyone, if they are or they're not. Do not assume because a person does not appear to have a disability that he or she is faking or imagining their disability. Again, the hidden dimensions of disabilities. We cannot assume, we cannot know what it's like to be that person. Excuse me. And legally, with the ADA covering so many internal functions, it doesn't matter. You know, it doesn't matter. You have to err on the side of providing accommodations and being accessible. Do not assume that a companion accompanying a person with a disability is there to be of service. Okay? Do not assume a person with a disability will be receptive to personal questions. Do not assume when a person with a disability is in public, they are being escorted by a caregiver, that they're not alone. I mean, sometimes you look with a person and you think, well, where is your person who helps you? They might not need or want help. Okay. Another way we can do this is another one of the handouts, person first language or people first language. A practical technique to avoid dehumanizing people with disabilities. You emphasize, very simple, like it says, person first, anything else second. Okay, so here's just some examples. You say people with disabilities, not handicapped or disabled. Okay, he has a cognitive you put the person first. He has a cognitive disability, not that he is mentally retarded or challenged. And I also, there's another word there. You know, these are tips directly from Disability First website that I'm going to give you in a second. Disability is Natural website. I hate that retarded word. It is a terrible word. Get it out of your vocabulary. I'm sure most of you already have. There are some actually movements throughout the country to have a R word and a red line crossed through it. Don't even go there. It's not. Words and language evolve. It used to be appropriate to call people with cognitive disabilities idiots. Our language evolves. That's one that's got to go. Okay, put the person first. She uses a wheelchair, mobility chair, not she is confined to or she is wheelchair bound. Use a person without disability, not normal or healthy. Okay, this is different. I like the way that one is framed because it just, person without a disability, number one, that's probably suspect. I'm not sure that there is such a thing because we're all human. But I love how that reframes the dichotomy of labeling and categorizing. Okay, some additional resources as we're kind of nearing the end. And some of these are a little bit atypical. Again, I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel. There's tons of resources out there. The trick is going to be finding out where are the gaps in your programs and services and accessibility in your libraries, in your daily interactions and practices, and then what are the best resources. I don't think you don't have to create them. Okay, and so what I try to do here is give you 3 that you might not necessarily find in your normal, wonderful experience of, being able to find the resources that you need. This is your profession, so I thought these might be off the beaten track for some of you. First, CARF, Commission on Accreditation of Rehabilitation Facilities. This organization, while it's an it accredits particular organizations that help people with disabilities, they have a lot of resources and articles on their website. So and it really is designed to help those organizations that are designed to help people with disabilities. So I think that, since they have been in the business for a long time, excuse me, and they are accrediting the people who have been in the business for a long time, that it's kind of a shortcut look to getting in there. Secondly, the Disabilities is Natural. This is a wonderful website from which one of the handouts that I gave you has come from. Vera Institute of Justice, again, this is one of the ones that have the intersection of violence with there. Again, a whole other topic, but people with disabilities are much more likely to experience violence than people without disabilities. So Vera Institute of Justice just is doing some amazing work in communities across the country, and lots of resources and articles for there, and also some intersections with like the criminal justice system and on a lot of national levels that are good. You know, ultimately we're going here for empathy and accessibility. You know, what we want to do is battle that ableism, create a cultural shift in the way we think, we feel, and we take action about accessibility. And again, remember, this occurs on an individual level, on an organizational level, and as a society level. And, you know, really increasing the empathy. I love this quote, you know, seeing with the eyes of another, whether or not those eyes can see. Listening with the ears of another, whether or not those ears can hear. And feeling with the heart of another. I mean, that is really where we're going with this. And so I would just really encourage you to, you know, take a look at some of the other webinars that we've had, because, you know, I'm actually doing one on empathy coming up in a couple of weeks. But, you know, there's a lot of ways that we can go about becoming more empathetic and accessible to people, no matter what we're struggling with. Just a brief note on the handouts. I gave you an ADA reasonable accommodation sample policy. This is in plain language. Now, plain language, again, it would include person first language, but plain language is written simply. And if you think it is easy to simply write a policy, wow, are you in for a treat? Because it is not. And most policies and procedures are written in such a way you almost think people are intentionally trying to be deceptive. But if somebody had a cognitive disability and was trying to understand your policy on interlibrary loan materials, could you present it in a way, written format, that they would understand, or in a verbal way? You know, something to really think about. So I think that you know, while that reasonable accommodation policy is more for employment policies, it gives you an idea of how difficult it could be to revise some of your policies and procedures. The People First Language chart, again, some further examples on there than the ones that we went through. And then I gave that USF Students with Disabilities Services Guide. Again, my background is education, but I just thought that they had a really good layout of how they went through on the various technologies, and there was a lot of overlap on the technologies that they use, and I think that you use in most of your libraries. So again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you know, that's kind of where this is going. So I wanted to leave some space for, you know, questions or comments if you want to put those in there. Again, you know, I love the phrase keep calm and make it accessible. Libraries play a catalytic role in the lives of people with disabilities by facilitating their full participation in society. And that's really where we're going here, full participation, that we're not discriminating against, that we're not you know, that we're presenting with folks and, you know, and helping them access the information and resources that they need. So with that, I'm going to mute and let Aaron come on here if he wants and see if there's any questions that come in.
All right.
Let me know.
Thank you, Chris, for a wonderful webinar. Some information and a sneak peek of what is coming up. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, be sure to join us on Friday, March 3rd for Accessibility Points C is for Culture. Also, please join us next Wednesday, February 15th for Understanding HR Legalities, on Friday, February 17th for When Opportunity Knocks, Growing Up or Out, and on Thursday, February 23rd for Launching an Idea from Concept to Crowdfunding, Bringing Your Projects to Life. We encourage you to look at the upcoming webinars and workshops in months ahead, and hope you're all able to join us for future training opportunities. As always, please feel free to keep checking the SWFLN CE calendar on our SWFLN website, the SWFLN Facebook page, or look for your message from the Florida Library listserv. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a terrific weekend.